Hello, and welcome back. So I wanted to provide some context for this particular content on gender dysphoria. It is in the DSM, and there have been discussions about removing it, and they have elected to leave it in because the diagnosis is what has historically provided opportunity for insurance to cover gender affirming care. So what is the context? First, even though it's in the DSM, it is not a mental illness. Identifying as a gender that is inconsistent with societal expectations of how that should match your physical sex. It's not abnormal, okay? Just because something occurs in a small proportion of a population does not mean that it is abnormal. It just means that it is less common. So what is the evidence to support that this is not a mental illness issue? First, everything is on a spectrum. I don't know what your background is in biology, but I can tell you that sex is on a spectrum. Your physical sex is on a spectrum, and it absolutely depends on how a person or an agency or a legal system or a legislative body defines sex. So you've probably heard a lot in the news, or if you've watched recently any of the legislative discussions around what is a woman, right? Can you define what a woman is? Because the assumption is that, well, it is somebody who has a uterus, or somebody who has a vagina, or somebody who has breasts, right? And medical providers, if you've watched, are very hesitant to define that and continue to emphasize the complexity of sex, the complexity of gender. So think of it this way. Your sex, your physical sex, right, is generally rooted in the genitalia and your reproductive organs. Your gender is up here, all right? How you perceive yourself, how you feel comfortable in how you express yourself to others. And think of your sexual orientation as here in your heart. But biology drives all of these. So for example, if we were to break down simply sex, are you male or female based on your genitalia? No, because intersex people exist. And even though it is a small proportion of the population, they are born all the time, and they, by being intersex, means that they have portions of both biologically sex-oriented anatomy, right? Doesn't mean you have complete sets of both, but you have some aspects of both at a minimum, okay? You also have variations in hormones, which can change the way that your body physically grows and presents itself, the phenotype. I don't know why I'm using air quotes. The phenotype, right? The physical manifestation of your biological sex is heavily influenced by hormones. It can also be heavily influenced by certain disorders like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. For example, the excess amount of cysts on ovaries can shift the hormonal balance. And these individuals, regardless of what sex organs they have, altogether, right? Well, obviously they have to have ovaries, but you know what I mean, in case they're intersex, are going to manifest very masculine physiological features like excess facial hair. Sometimes they can grow complete beards and mustaches, right? Another way that we could consider sex is chromosomes, right? 2 X's is female, X and Y is male. However, sometimes you can be born with XXY, or you can have XYY. Well, what does that mean then, right? How does that change the manifestation of sex? Well, believe it or not, those who have XXY tend to have more what society considers female physiological, emotional, and psychological characteristics because it's biologically driven, okay? So then if we can't be clear about what's male, what's female, then why do we have to be clear about gender? So gender identity is on a spectrum. And what we know is that gender identity changes throughout a person's lifetime. Does it swing from one extreme to another all the time? No, it doesn't have to, but it can. I myself, my gender identity and how I manifest my feminine and masculine characteristics varies, not only according to the stage in my life, looking back from where I was to where I am, and I think about where I'm headed when I look at my mom. That's another story. I'll also do it according to context, which is not uncommon, especially for women in society. For example, I work in a STEM field, so I am primarily a scientist. And while I have a clinical background and a neurological background or neuroscience background, most of my effort is in research, right? That's really what I get paid to do most of the time. Being a woman in STEM often comes with quite a bit of bias, assumptions, and stereotypes that can impede my ability to be successful, okay? So when I am in certain settings, and for those of you who might be in STEM fields or know someone who is, you might notice greater masculine characteristics emerge, where they will literally change their body language. They talk about taking up more space, take up more physical space, right? Changing dress, where I will definitely dress more masculine. I will not go in wearing dresses or skirts or high heels. I will often wear my hair up. I will rarely ever leave it down if I'm in a science-oriented meeting. Why? Because for some reason it makes a difference in how I'm treated. So how we choose to present our gender identity can be based on, how we feel at the core, can be contextual given the circumstances, and it can be something that shifts according to how our own biology and experience affects us throughout the lifespan. Individuals generally who are identified and self-identify as transgendered, meaning identify as a gender identity that is considered the opposite of their biological sex. They generally know in toddlerhood. We can see repeated evidence as early as 3 years old of a gender identity that's emerging, regardless of the environment they're in, regardless of the parenting strategies that are employed, regardless of what they're exposed to in social situations. Why is that? Because your gender identity is biologically rooted. Up here, we can see patterns based on female hormone levels during pregnancy as to the degree of masculinity or femininity, regardless of sex, in their children. From birth on, we can start to see changes. And it is mathematically correlated to the biology of mom when she was pregnant. We also can see variations in gender identity. I'm using air quotes because I'm about to shift to animal literature. In animals, where they will shift sort of the manifestation of their behavior towards other animals that seems inconsistent with the way that sex of the animal typically behaves. This is something that has been present in humankind for as long as we have been keeping record of it. Okay? Record of humans, period. In some cultures, this was considered a spiritual gift, and it was praised and not necessarily worshipped, but cherished as something that was special and unique about the individual. A lot of anti-LGBTQIA legislation has been being passed in recent months. And none of us really know where it's headed, but a lot of hate is making its way into policy. And I want to be absolutely clear with each and every one of you that this is not a mental illness. This is not, when we think about individuals who make a drastic shift from what's expected to how they actually feel and want to present, compared to how society thinks they should according to their sexual organs. They're born that way, right? I'm going to quote Lady Gaga. Believe that in a lecture. That's the way that their biology is set up. And to make accusations that this is an illness, that it is a derivative of what is natural, those are false. Those are scientifically false. We all live and exist on a spectrum. Okay, so for example, if you were to operationalize a woman as somebody who has breasts, a uterus, ovaries, right? I would no longer be considered a woman. In fact, my gynecologist jokes about that because my mother had breast cancer several years ago. She carried a genetic mutation for that, the BRCA gene. Whole family was tested. Everybody came back negative except me. And because of my age, I was required to undergo a double mastectomy and a complete hysterectomy. I have no estrogen, absolutely no estrogen. I'm not allowed to take supplements. I have no ovaries, no fallopian tubes, no uterus. I have absolutely no natural breast tissue left. Okay. So technically, I'm no different biologically if we just look at the physical self than, say, a trans person who had shifted their sex male to female. If they did sexual reassignment surgery, right? So does that mean that I'm not a woman? Does that mean that I'm not female? Most people would say, no, 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 no. You were born female, so you're female. My ovaries, my uterus, my original breasts are not what made me identify as a female, as a woman, as a young girl, as a woman. It's not, because I don't have them anymore and I still identify that way. And it's not because of what I've learned throughout life either. Because whenever I engage in behaviors in business-oriented arenas in order to shift how I behave and how I look, to sort of combat stereotypes and bias against women in science, it feels unnatural to me. But I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm doing it. And I engage in it. But up here, right, it feels unnatural to me. And that has nothing to do with my level of estrogen. Okay? It has nothing to do with female organs that are in my body. It has nothing to do even with training, because I have learned that if I behave differently, I am treated differently. But because it feels unnatural, I only do it in certain settings. Does that make sense? So, how a person truly identifies in terms of their gender is not a mental illness. Does it mean that they don't have mental health issues? No, anybody. Gosh, looking at the news lately, I'm beginning to think that we all do to some degree. It has been a rough several years. Can you hear me? But it in itself is not. It is a completely natural, biologically driven phenomenon of our brain and how it forms in the womb, how much of it is affected by our hormones, which are also affected by the genes that we inherit, the hormonal environment in which we form as an embryo and fetus in the womb. Absolutely. And to clarify, when I say genes that you inherit, there aren't genes that predict gender dysphoria. It's not a mutated gene or anything like that. But we all inherit variations of genes that regulate our hormones, our neurotransmitters, the development of our brain, and those variations, which occur very common across the population, create slight differences in how our bodies regulate. And those slight differences, the guiding theory in science right now says that's why we see changes. Anecdotally, society observes this every day. When I was growing up, it was not uncommon to call young girls who tended to be more sports-oriented, who liked to play, rough with the other boys in the neighborhood, who wore pants all the time, who weren't really, dressing frilly and trying to get attention from boys. They were called tomboys. Growing up, I had a really strong tomboy kind of persona. I had a brother, and the only way that I had any entertainment was if I could play with my brother. And so I often engaged in things that he did. But that doesn't define me, right? I define me. And individuals, just like you, define yourself. Think about that for a minute. Think about where you are on the spectrum, not just male to female in terms of gender identity. But where do you fall within either of those categories on the spectrum, right? I am far less feminine than some of my peers, but also more feminine than others. And if I'm having a really cranky day, you could argue that maybe I show some more masculine characteristics. And for the gentlemen in the class, I'm not saying that means you're cranky. It's just society kind of frowns upon women who are not smiling all the time and happy and compliant. So anytime that you kind of buck the system, it's considered to be more masculine or derogatory for feministic characteristics. Anyway, I digress. Not a mental illness, but it has been left in the DSM in order to try and provide opportunity for insurance to cover gender affirming care, which in many states now, several states, it is becoming illegal. And not just for children, they're now doing it for adults. And what kind of implication does that have for your clients? And as a clinician, that's something you would have to think about. What would it be like if you yourself were told that you couldn't be who you believe that you need to be, and that you need to behave differently and dress differently and engage in things that you don't agree with and that don't feel right to you? How would that affect your mental state, right? Okay, so not a disorder. Sexual orientation is on a spectrum. Physical sex is on a spectrum, our biological sex, depending on what variation of chromosomes and hormone levels and sexual organs that we have. And gender identity is on a spectrum. And each of us is beautifully and wonderfully a collection of some variation of all three of those spectrums. Difference is a wonderful thing because it adds to society. It adds to our problem-solving capabilities. It adds to just the variation in experience, right? If we were all absolutely 100% identical all of the time, well, geez, what would be the fun in getting to know people, right? We would max out our lived experience pretty early on. And then what's the fun in life when there aren't new things to learn and experience and enjoy and avoid? And, thinking about life, it's not all, chocolates and roses. Anyway, not a disorder. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. This is not something that is regularly discussed. It is in the literature, but I'm mindful of all of the reading that I have given you. And so I just wanted to make the video to make this clear and save you several articles. But you are more than welcome to read about it. And if you want additional resources, I'm happy to share anything with you and as much of it as you want. Okay. Thank you for listening.